100 years ago, Ireland was poised on the threshold of enormous change. The fight for an independent Ireland was about to take a hugely significant turn, and the First World War was at its peak. Although the battlefields were on mainland Europe, much closer to home in the town of Oldcastle, North Meath, the former workhouse had been turned into a prisoner of war camp, and in the gathering dusk of a late summer's evening, two men make a dash for freedom.
Tonight is the night. We must take our chance.
Do you have our disguise?
Yes, I have the clothes hidden. As soon as it gets dark tonight, we must make our escape. Do you have the map?
Yes, I got it from our friend today. Let us hope it will lead us away from this place and to freedom.
The camp housed almost 700 German and Austrian men in a building that was well fortified. The alarm was quickly raised and search parties were organised. The escape did not go unnoticed by the local press.
Meath Chronicle, August 14th, 1915. German prisoners escaped from Oldcastle. A sensation was caused in Oldcastle on Wednesday evening last when it was found that two of the German prisoners who were among the occupants of the detention camp in the workhouse premises had escaped during the evening. The fugitives are Karl Morlang, aged 25, and Alphonsus Green, aged 21. Before the outbreak of the war, both were employed as ship's officers. How they managed to elude the vigilance of the guard is a mystery. Patrols were immediately sent out to scour the surrounding county, and on the following morning, telegrams were dispatched to the police stations in every part of the country. Since then, a sharp lookout has been kept, but so far the fugitives have succeeded in evading detection.
This is the story of the 40-kilometre journey taken by Karl Morlang and Alphonsus Green through the lanes and byways of North Meath and Cavan. Along the route, we discover the Ireland of 1915, a country on the brink of huge social, political and economic change. Our journey starts in Oldcastle, at the site of the former workhouse and prisoner of war camp, where local historian Jerry Boylan takes up the story.
Where we're standing now would have been just at the back of the main building complex, although looking around you now there's nothing to see from that era. Indeed, if you could bring a prisoner back that was here, he wouldn't recognise the place. As you can see around you, it's now a lovely little housing estate, mostly built, I believe, in the early 1950s, which replaced the workhouse building, which of course was used as the prisoner of war camp. All that's left is the wall that's behind you there, which has the original date stone of the building, 1842, in it. That was the outer wall of the old complex. The whole complex covered an area of about 4 acres, but the scene here has completely changed since those days. Basically not a trace of the original building left.
Author and historian John Smith has written about the history of both the workhouse and the prisoner of war camp in Oldcastle. He describes how the workhouse became a prisoner of war camp.
The War Office were looking for permanent buildings by August 1914, and they were looking for things like schools and workhouses. Now, a workhouse, if you think about it, it's a very large complex. It has a lot of facilities that you can hold several hundred people. Dormitories, infirmaries, washrooms, cooking facilities, running water. It was also self-contained. The workhouses were surrounded by fairly high walls, 10-foot walls in some cases. So it appears they contacted the local government board looking for workhouse buildings. By November 1914, the POW camp, the workhouse in Oldcastle, was commandeered by the War Office. It was essentially a civilian internment camp for German and Austrian nationals throughout the war period. In that sense, it was unique.
Do we know what the local people thought about this?
They knew, of course, the prisoners were coming. I mean, they could clearly see the camp being prepared, and they knew the inmates had been removed from the camp. There's folk memory of people trading with the Germans, of items being made. There is evidence of some cladded rings that had been made by goldsmiths or silversmiths, I guess, in the workhouse. There's also painted postcards that were made by the Germans and Austrian prisoners, and so there seems to be some interaction in the early days. My suspicion is in the later time this came to an end because of the escapes. Security was tightening up, if you like, but there's also in the folk memory they're singing, their music. I mean, there was a couple of bands and choirs in the workhouse, so that's unsurprising that people would remark that they were the wonderful singers. There was wonderful music coming out of the workhouse.
It wasn't all painting pictures and singing sweet music for the inmates of the camp, as a reporter from the Meath Chronicle noted when he visited in June 1915.
On arrival, I saw a large body of men, fine, strapping young fellows they were. They were passing the time away idly, some sitting on the benches around the grounds, some leaning out of the windows and watching around them at ease. Others were exercising themselves by marching in twos round the place. I failed to obtain any information as to whether these men were engaged in any industry in the place.
I wonder what was in the minds of those two men as they contemplated their escape. Like, what sort of place were they escaping from?
These were naval personnel, they weren't civilians. They would have had training, they would have been used to living, shall we say, in regimented conditions on board ship or what have you. So it wouldn't have been as great of an upset to them as it was for the civilian men who were put in here. But they longed for their freedom. They were men that were at war with the British Empire. They were young men, 23 and 24 years of age. They were in their prime. They were holed up in here. It was monotonous. Each day was the same as the day before. It was tedious. There were young men that wanted to get out and get back into the war, basically.
And what sort of life would they have had here?
They would have lived in dormitories. At one time in this building, there were 24 ship's captains. They got preferential treatment. The British society, of course, was very class conscious. So the higher up you were in the pecking order, the better treatment and the better conditions you got. Captains usually got a room of their own, whereas ordinary naval officers would have lived in dormitories with 10 to 20 other men. It would have been a Spartan conditions. Most of the complaints that we come across were not about conditions that were held in, it was about the food. Because as the war went on, the food was cut, the rations were cut. That was the main bone of contention between them. But it would have been a dreary, mundane life for the men in here. Any chance they got to get out, they would have taken it.
And do we know how they got out? Is there anything known about how they actually did escape?
The authorities never found out exactly how they got out. There's some story that they got out dressed as women, which is doubted by some of the people who looked into it. The man who was picked up for it afterwards, for aiding them, Charlie Fox, we know had access to the camp kitchens. So we believe that he brought in the clothes for the men to use when they escaped. But actually how they got out of the building has never been found out.
But nevertheless, it was on an August evening that they did make their way from this camp to where?
Well, they got out via Mount Nugent, we believe, skirting Ballyjamestuff and definitely ending up in, we know for certain that they were in Crissalaw, just outside Kinnerlegg. Now, they had maps and they had plenty of money. These men would have not have a clue where they were. They were totally lost. They wouldn't have even known where Oldcastle was. Never mind trying to find their way to Cavan. So they had rudimentary maps drawn up for them. There would have been safe houses waiting for them along the way. Basically, they were on their own. They wandered around the countryside, but they managed to eventually make their way to Cavan via Kinnerlegg. But they had people along the way they met. Now, who these people were, I'm afraid, has been lost in history. There would have been Republicans along the way to aid them along and give them shelter for the night.
Well, let's go now and see if we could retrace some of that route.
Follow you.
Right. OK, Jerry, well, we've made it as far as the River Inny in Mount Nugent. How do you think they might have got this far?
Well, this is easily within a day's walk. You're only talking a couple of hours, perhaps, from Oldcastle, so they could easily have done this on the first day. From here on in, it's a little bit convoluted roads that they may have taken, we're not sure. But we do know that the next stop from Mount Nugent was in Crissalaw. Now, if you're heading directly from Mount Nugent to Kinnerlegg, there's a road straight. You certainly wouldn't go by Crissalaw, but these guys were trying to keep off the beaten track.
So what might the countryside have looked like as they made their way out here or along these roads?
Well, Sue, it wouldn't really have changed all that much. The green fields are basically the same. There is records that the road from Kinelec to Oldcastle was lined with trees all the way, which ironically were cut down during the First World War to be sent off to France to help in the war effort. But other than that, the landscape they would have seen would have probably been recognisable to them today. For example, the bridge here beside us hasn't changed. It's certainly no wider than it was in them days. So they would recognise the countryside. It hasn't changed that much.
Whilst the green fields and rolling hills of North Meath might not have changed much in the last 100 years, the early decade of the last century was hugely turbulent and set in train many political, social and economic changes in Ireland. Historian Malachy Hand lives and farms just outside Oldcastle. So Malachy, we're 100 years on now from that escape in Oldcastle that I'm trying to track down. What was the political situation around North Meath around 1915 or shortly before?
Well, I suppose North Meath would be like a lot of other places in the country. Irish volunteers were well set up at this stage. And of course, this was a kind of to counteract the Ulster volunteers that was being formed from, I think, 1913 or so. And they were very well armed, and this was to counteract that, if you want to call it a threat or something, to balance it in some way. But of course, generally what was happening at the time, there was a whole new nationalistic spirit coming along, the Irish language, the Gaelic Athletic Association, and all this was coming to the fore. And of course, the Irish language, people were trying to get back into everyday use.
Would you think there was, in this area, the North Meath general area, there was particularly nationalistic sentiment?
Well, it appears that there was, because a few things that we do know is that there was a pamphlet published in Oldcastle in 1902, I think it was, and it was called Sinn Féin, and of course that means we ourselves, so that was very nationalist spirit, you know. That was unique in a sense, that was the first time that title was used as far as we know, and the people that set up that were quite nationalistic. Again, we also know that Arthur Griffith had strong connections with Oldcastle, as did Pádraig Pearse say some words at the launch of that pamphlet, probably before Pádraig Pearse was as well known as he subsequently was, but he was in Oldcastle. So there was a couple of well-known characters like Charlie Fox.
What about the effects of the Land Acts around here? What sort of effect would that have had on agriculture and farming and people's property?
Oh, I think it had a huge effect. I think it was probably one of the biggest changes that happened in the history of Ireland in modern times is that the Land Acts first got to do with tenancy, giving rights to tenant farmers, which never had any real rights, the smaller tenants especially. And then subsequently with various acts up to 1903, I think it was, when there was the Wynham Act, and farmers, ordinary tenants, were allowed to buy out their farms and had full rights of it then, and they actually become property owners. And this maybe probably changed their thinking as well. You kind of got a new kind of a middle class. These were the people that were buying stuff now, and they had, you know, some farm to set their plans around, so they were really upgrading their farms. And large hardware shops in Oldcastle, I suppose, part of that. And I think it had a massive change in the culture of the rural community anyway.
Would Oldcastle have been a thriving town at that time?
Oh, it appears that it was quite thriving post-famine. Well, probably since the coming of the railway. The railway came in 1863 and, of course, survived just 100 years to 1963. But that, of course, was a focus of goods coming into Oldcastle that had to be collected from the small villages and towns for maybe a 10-mile radius were coming to Oldcastle, as was the big fairs. And Oldcastle had a massive fair because carriage loads of cattle used to go out of Oldcastle, probably direct up to the ports of Drogheda, to go direct to England, and the railway had a big say in that.
And then I'm thinking about, you've got a town where about 600 internees are coming into it of German and Austrian background. That must have made a queer bit of a rumpus.
Well, sure, it must have been a huge news item at the time. And then of course they had to be fed, and as well as that there was X amounts of soldiers to mind them, so it must have made a huge kind of a difference. It's probably to the economy of the town as well as the talk and the folklore around the town.
And do you think it brought the war that bit nearer for people?
Well, of course, what we do know, which we didn't seem to realise, I'm sure somebody knew it, that there was so many involved in the war from the local community. We think possibly up near 200 in the broader Oldcastle area. But this brought home, in a sense, those prisoners, probably people would speak in German that you could hear through the fences or if you walk by. Indeed, they used to be out exercising, so I'm sure people were very familiar with the prisoners that were in the camp.
And we're talking about a time of extraordinary change as well in the world between the war and then the upcoming rise in the following year. It must have been an extraordinary time to be alive in Ireland.
Yeah, it must have been. I suppose when you live through a time you don't realise, but in hindsight, what of course, imagine the most able-bodied men and women are armed at the time. Now the arms were, of course, fairly basic stuff, but at least quite dangerous. So that in itself, and indeed it's well known that in the British Parliament, when the First World War broke out, there was more talk of Ireland than there was of the war in Germany, because they were so afraid of a full-scale civil war in Ireland. It was imminent. I suppose it was the First World War probably that might have saved that, you know, that didn't happen. We had civil war later, but it would have been, it was an awful dangerous time, you know, that it could have been full-scale civil war if Home Rule was imposed at the time. And indeed, if the opposite of it wasn't, the Nationalists would be an uprising, which did happen, but I suppose the First World War dampened that in a sense, because a lot of the young men were away fighting that war.
So Jerry, this is Kilnalek. How far are we from Oldcastle here?
Well, Sue, if you take the direct route through Mount Nugent, it's exactly 10 miles, which is around 16 kilometres. But we know that the men didn't walk directly. They went back roads through the countryside, skirting Ballyjames-Duff, round by Crishalaw. So they probably walked 15 to 20 miles to get here. But they were young men and were fit, and it was no bother to them.
And they had great incentive to keep going.
Oh yes, they had great incentive to keep going, is right. They weren't going back to Oldcastle if they could help it.
So we're here actually to meet Peter Brady, who I think can bring us another stage of the journey, can describe a little bit more of the journey. So we'll go down the town now and see if we can meet up with him. Where we are now, in a lovely little pub, aptly named Brady's Pub.
Yeah.
It's just down the road from the RIC station here in Kilnalek. Now, our two heroes, Carl Morlang and Alphonsus Green, passed through Kilnalek, and the story goes they were spotted by a constable.
That is true, and constable would be the correct word, because you see, when you talk about Kilnalek and Garda Barracks, you're talking about three. There was the RIC barracks down at the end of the village here. There was the two-storied one that's on the right-hand side on the way up, and then there's the one on the left-hand side, which was built in the 1950s. So it was the one at the bottom of the town.
We were looking inside earlier at an almanac from 1899, and it said that the population of Kilnalek at the time was about 390. Would that have been about the population in 1915? Or?
There would be a bit of emigration now, of course, that would have taken it down. I would say 350 might be a better one. As you look in that almanac that's there, you'll see the great activity that was going on and all the trades that were going on.
And if the two did pass through here, and as far as we know they did, and it's all, shrouded in mystery at this stage, but what might people have thought of them? They were dressed, as far as we know, in clerical garb. They probably spoke a bit of English, but what do you think people of the time might have thought of them?
Oh, a lot of people would have covered up for them. Because if they were anti-British, well then that was it. They would cover up for them, and there was no doubt about that. A lot of people had turned against the British because they had lost so many people, and there was so and so and so and so. Even to this day, in this general area, travellers are accepted and always accepted. Because I think what drove them there was that each and every family in this whole area of South Cavan had people who had to go to America the time of the Great Hunger. So that's the kind of Ireland that we would have, and to a great extent it's still the Ireland that we have here. There is a homeliness about it that's in the people. Nobody coming around here that was ever sick or sorry, whatever, was let go without getting something and getting some kind of help.
The other thing that strikes me about this area, driving around the place, is the network of roads, boreens, laneways, all sorts. There's plenty of places for people to wander and get lost.
Oh, there are. Well, of course, the way that came about was that the farms were small. And a lot of farms didn't go out to the main road, so they had to build a laneway up to the farm. Then the roads are crooked, and that was because the area is hilly, so they built the little roads round the hill.
So it's probably a good part of the world for our two adventurers to get lost and end up God knows where.
Oh, it is, because if we think about Loch Sheelan, which would be the great scenic thing that we have, but you can walk in there and you can walk around for a couple of hours and you won't find yourself turning and coming back.
The other thing that you mentioned to me before outside was that there's a lot of little shebeens in this area, or there certainly was back in the 1915s.
Oh yes, there were. Now in my parish there would have been 3. There was another one then, and this was very good. It was up on the townland called Towla, and this is the one that I think that those men were talking about probably did go, because there's a winding road coming there, and then you come to another part of a very winding road. Then you go up a high hill, then you twist around and it divides in 2 or 3, and then coming down near the bottom of it again is the site of that shebeen. And now it says in your document there that it was very hard to find, and I think that these German men came that way. In addition to that, they would have been coming close to the Mullingar-Cavan road through Ballinya, and my guess is that they went that way, maybe spent some time in the shebeen, went out to the main road and went then to Ballinya and for the train in Cavan. Now, I'd agree that they probably came across from Crosskeys, because it would be cross-country, it would be narrow little roads as well. The people there would be the same as the people here, and they would have protected them or give them a shot out or give them a bit of food to go on, because there's a good bit of romanticism about the Irish all the time, and it's great to hide a fellow that's on the run, you know. It was, and then an informer, of course, was nearly always shot. He was, you never informed on anyone at that time. So that's why I think that might be the route from Oldcastle down across the country, over through, skirting around Ballyjamestuff, down into Crosskeys, across through Kilnalek, where they got away into remote country here again, across bogs and the like of that, finished up at Towla and then went on to Cavan. I'm only really putting 2 and 2 together, but I suppose it's nearly as good as anything else,
On the way out the door, I spotted a picture taken of Main Street, Kilnalek in 1912, and Peter explained just what a lively spot the town was at the time.
You're looking at a photograph from 1912. These are all shops of some descriptions. That is a hotel at that particular time. There's another hotel in that premises, and there's one there and one there at the other side of the street. This was a bakery, and that was a drapery. Now, every single shop on both sides of the street were in business in some way or another. That is probably taken on a Sunday, because that man is pouring a bottle of stout into a glass, and the other man has his hands in his pockets, but he's well dressed.
It's great to see it, because it really gives you a visual image of what our 2 escapees might have arrived into.
Oh yes, the way they would have arrived was this road. It would have come that way. That would come over from Denn, it would come over from Crosserlaw, come over from Crosskeys, it would have come over from the Cavan Ballyjamestuff road,
Okay.
or generally in that direction. So that would be their line that brought them down in here.
Great. Wow.
But it's 1,000,000 to 1, but somebody covered them up here and would have directed them across country and gave them the ideas of the little boreens and the like of that,
Well, that was fascinating listening to Peter there. And just looking at that photograph, Jerry, of Kilnalek in 1912, it was quite a fair town. And do you think they took a bit of a risk actually coming in here?
Well, Sue, it was actually a very silly thing to do, because when they escaped from Oldcastle, the alert went out to all the police stations in the area, throughout County Meath, County Cavan and all the surrounding areas, and the policemen here in Kilnalek would have been well aware of the escape and would have been on the lookout for these men. But you have to remember, Sue, that they were a very different police force than the one that we have today. They were armed, they were organised on military lines, they lived in the barracks. We still call Garda stations here barracks, but in those days they were actually barracks with men stationed there 24 hours a day. They were the eyes and ears of Dublin Castle, and they worked for the establishment. So they were well aware that these men had escaped and were on the lookout for them. So to actually come near any urban area like this was a silly mistake. So they must have had to meet up with somebody or to get somewhere to stay for the night. or something like that. Otherwise, they could have skirted the town here easily with the maze of little roads there is. There was no need for them to come into town, but obviously they did, and they were spotted.
And if that policeman spotted them, and we assume he did, how would he have gotten word back to wherever he needed to get word back to say he'd seen them?
Well, they had telephones. At the time, there probably was only one telephone. Most towns' numbers started with 1, 2, 3, 4. Number 1 was the post office, and number 2 was the police station. So it would have been quite easy for them to get contact back to Oldcastle to alert them that these men had been spotted. Some constable jumped on his bike and made off in pursuit of these 2 men. Eventually, they did track them to Cavan.
OK, so he was probably on the blower to Cavan just as they were heading off down that road. That's the road over there now that they reckon leads off to Den, which is where we're going to head next.
Yes. And there is another little back road that when we were coming from Crisaloch, they could have gone down and missed Kinelec completely. So, as I say, obviously they were meeting somebody here. They were going to get something to eat and maybe a bed for the night.
OK, well, let's hit Den.
Let's hit Den.
Let's see that map. I think we are lost now.
No, I am sure it is this way. That fellow in the village said that this is the road we must take.
But there are so many roads.
Yes, I know, but we must keep heading north. The further away from that camp, the better. Now come on, quickly.
As Morlang and Green wandered the byways of North Meath and Cavan, rumours about their means of escape abounded in local papers.
A story suggesting that the escape had been carefully pre-arranged is going the rounds. It is that on the day before they succeeded in getting away, the prisoners were visited by 2 lady friends who came from Dublin by the morning train, and on presenting themselves at the detention camp were permitted to interview them. It is supposed that the visitors had arranged for a motor car to be in readiness at an appointed rendezvous, and that they contrived during the interview to give the prisoners a hint as to their plans. Another story, for the truth of which we cannot vouch, is that on Wednesday evening a motor car driven by a strange-looking person passed through Kells, going in the direction of Oldcastle.
Well, it certainly is true to its name, Jerry. You would never find this place if you didn't know where you were going.
You certainly wouldn't stumble across it now. As I say, they had maps and they knew where they were going. Well, by the maps, because other than that they were completely and utterly lost, and I'm not too sure that we're not lost ourselves.
It's off-road.
Off-road, definitely, yes.
Lovely country though.
Beautiful, and good roads.
Good roads now, but what would these roads have been like, do you think, in 1915?
Well, they certainly weren't tarred anyway, just stone, and probably potholed, not well kept at all, I don't think. Mind you, there was very, very, very few motor cars them days.
So they'd have been on foot, of course.
They were on foot and everybody else was on ass and carts, basically, so...
It's a fair bit of ground to cover all the same, wasn't it?
It was a long walk. They were walking for 2 days, basically, but as I say, they were young men and they were fit.
Is that it up ahead, Jerry, do you think?
Yes, it is. A very different modern building, though, than the 2 guys from Oldcastle would have seen.
I tell you, that was some job finding that.
Would you find it again, Sue, on your own?
I have no idea where. Oh, here we are. Look, the tank bar.
Yes, here we are.
Perfect.
Must find out where did the name the tank come from.
Absolutely, yeah. Hopefully we'll get a cup of coffee as well.
Yeah, it's a bit early for a pint, isn't it?
It's a bit early for a pint. I'm parching after all that navigation.
Imagine how they felt, the 2 guys, when they arrived here. I'm sure it wasn't coffee they were after.
Indeed.
Can you see that light up ahead?
Where?
Look there. Look through the trees.
I hope it is that place where we can get some refreshment.
Yes, perhaps some beer. It has been a long, long walk.
Here's a cup of coffee, Sue.
Oh, just the job. Yeah. It's a grand little spot, isn't it?
Beautiful.
Yeah, no, it's hard to wonder though what it was like 100 years ago, isn't it?
Well, Sue, it would be nothing like this anyway. A lovely modern pub. Seemingly the 2 guys from Oldcastle enjoyed it here anyway. They bought drinks for everybody in the pub, which went down very well. The people in the pub actually thought they were Scotsmen.
Oh.
Because they had a strange accent and thought they were Scotch.
Not a lot of people would have heard a German accent anyway.
Oh, not at all, no.
Because this is deep. We're in Cavan now, aren't we?
You're in Cavan here. You're not too far from, as my father used to say, the butt of the mountain, which is the bottom, Arkle Mountain, Ardkill, which means High Church.
Yeah, you'd wonder, all right, what people made of them coming in off the road. But I mean, it was such an off the beaten track kind of place. They couldn't have seen too many strangers around here.
No, you wouldn't have seen too many strangers, so they would have stood out.
Yeah.
Plus, they were well dressed. You know, what were two well dressed men walking the road into Cavan? You know, yes. They did silly things, basically.
Well, they were very foolish, weren't they, to be flashing the cash around here?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, they did stand out, yeah.
All along in our story, we've been thinking that the bar in Den was a shebeen at the time that Morlang and Green passed through. However, as luck would have it, the Tank Bar's current owner, Gary Boylan, and one of his customers were able to shed further light on the origins of the place.
When we bought the thing, we went through Boyle, the solicitor. He showed me the papers. There was a pub back in 1876 or something like that. That was
wow.
Because on the road to Dundalk. It's like it's the main road.
This would have been?
Yeah, up there, yeah. Across the lane and up and out of Redford, yeah.
Getaway.
Was, yeah.
Wow.
Up the Cross Keys, that's why Cross Keys is called Cross Keys. People used to stop there and shot their horses and stuff. It was all on the main road to Dundalk or Drogheda. Yeah.
Because, I mean, at the moment it feels like it's the middle of nowhere. You know, sorry to say that, but that's what it feels like to me.
Or the centre of
the centre of everywhere. Yeah.
Well, you're 4 miles from Cavan Town and you're 4 miles from Cross Keys, you're 4 miles from Kinderleck and you're 4 miles from Ballina. Yeah. So you're close enough to them.
Okay. But it was because we had it that it was actually a shebeen that they were found in, but it was actually.
That was a shebeen as far as I.
Unless they were in there.
Across the road, yeah.
They across the road.
In there.
That was a shebeen. If you go outside here now, and there's a little.
But not in 1915, it wouldn't have been a shebeen. That wasn't a shebeen then.
No, if this was a pub in 18, something.
Previous to that it was this was a crossroads.
Yeah.
Okay. So it might have made sense for them. They were on their way to Cavan.
Yeah.
Taking the back roads.
And then they got caught in Cavan.
Oh, they were taking the back roads. Yeah, they came overland, if you like.
That escaped. 2 Germans that escaped, but they landed here.
Did stick out in mind.
Yeah. Well, they were dressed one of them was dressed as a priest.
Oh.
And the word is
in
people.
The tank. He definitely stick out in mind.
Well, the word is that people thought they were Scottish. You know, people might have in 1915. Like, not a lot of people would have heard a German accent. You know, so. But anyway, that's interesting. So we're gonna carry on our journey anyway into Cavan and see how we get on.
Right.
So, thanks for that.
All right.
After their stop in the Tank Bar in Den, Morlang and Green made it to Cavan Town. According to John Smith, they stayed the night in the Farnham Arms Hotel, but their luck was about to run out.
Alphonsus, look at all these police. They are everywhere.
Stay calm, Carl. Try not to panic.
But there are dozens of constables gathered here. They must be searching for us.
Carl, your agitation will only draw their attention. Please stop looking around. We are so close to freedom now. Calm yourself.
Those two, over there. They're looking at us. I know it.
Just keep looking straight ahead and let us walk out the door. The train station is just around the corner now. Follow me.
Yeah, they stayed the night in the Farnham Arms Hotel. The following morning, there was a lot of commotion in the hotel because a local government board inspector had died in his bed during the night, and there was a lot of police around. There was a report somewhere of them thinking at that stage that the game was up once they saw the hotel swarm with these police authorities, the RIC. They managed anyway to sneak out of the hotel, nip out, as it were, in clerical garb. They ended up in Cavan train station, and the report goes that a tweed jacket was seen underneath the soutane. The soutane was sort of covering a jacket or a suit, and immediately he knew that these guys were in disguise. They were apprehended shortly after that.
Jerry, we've managed to find a quiet corner here in the Farnham Arms this morning. Now, there's one person whose name has cropped up over and over in our story, and that's Charlie Fox. What do we know about Charlie Fox?
An extraordinary man, several different sides to this gentleman. He first appears in 1902 with the launch of the Sinn Féin paper, which was a local newspaper for the Oldcastle area. The paper was launched on St Patrick's Day in 1902 in the Napper Arms Hotel in the middle of Oldcastle, and it was launched by none other than a young barrister named Porrick Pearse, who of course a few years later would become the leader of the 1916 Rising.
How and why would Charlie Fox have helped the escapees?
Well, he was a Republican. Simple as that. He was very, very much for an independent Ireland, even back in 1902. And by 1915, the time of the escape, he was a committed Republican.
So how did he help them?
Well, Charlie had the biggest businesses in Oldcastle. He had a draper's, a general merchant's, flower merchants. He was an auctioneer. He was one of those stores you walk in and buy anything. He also owned the cinema in the town, the first cinema that came along. So he was a very big, successful businessman. And as such, he provided services to the camp. We know that he had access to the kitchens because he sold them flour and other produce. So it was quite easy for him to smuggle in clothes, money, etc.
Meath Chronicle, 21st of August 1915. Oldcastle auctioneer arrested, charged with aiding escape of German prisoners. Quite a sensation was caused in Oldcastle district on Saturday morning when it was learned that late on the previous night, Mr. Charles Fox, a well-known Oldcastle auctioneer and merchant, was arrested on the charge of aiding and abetting the escape of German prisoners. It appears that, after the capture of the prisoners at Cavan on Friday, certain information reached the military authorities. During the day, great activity was displayed by the military and police. About 11 o'clock on Friday night, a military officer, the DMP detective, District Inspector Holmes, and a number of police proceeded towards the residence of Mr. Fox. A cordon of police having been placed before the house and a constable stationed at each of the two gateways bounding the premises, the military officer, the DMP man and the DI knocked at the hall door. The representatives of the Crown entered and said they wanted to see Mr. Fox. After a few moments, that gentleman presented himself and was placed under arrest on the charge already indicated. The authorities then demanded admission to the drapery shop. The door having been opened, they entered and proceeded to turn over the account books and to search in the drawers and among the shelves in the hope of discovering documents of an incriminatory character. While the search was being made, Mr. Fox, in his night habiliments, stood outside the counter in charge of a constable. Meantime, other portions of the house were being explored. After a while, Mr. Fox was removed to the police barracks, and search at the house having been completed with apparently negative results, the police withdrew.
Charlie Fox was arrested and held in Arbour Hill military prison in Dublin. However, his incarceration was short-lived, and on August the 28th, 1915, the Meath Chronicle reported that there were rejoicings in Oldcastle.
On Saturday, Mr. Fox, accompanied by his wife, travelled by the 3 p.m. train from Amiens Street to Kells, and hence by motorcar to Oldcastle. The news of his arrival spread quickly and was received on all sides with the utmost pleasure. At nightfall, the Workmen's Club Brass and Reed Band, which had been hastily resuscitated for the occasion, turned out and played round the square, accompanied by a number of torchbearers. Many people came in from the country to participate in the rejoicings.
Just why Charlie Fox was released is not clear, although one story has it that his wife used her own connections to intervene on his behalf.
There's a lot of stories told around Oldcastle about exactly what happened. As I mentioned earlier on, he was a decorated British soldier, but there is a story, and I know this to be true because it was told to a friend of mine, by Charlie's daughter. As a very old woman, she told the story of when she was a little girl going with her mother on the train to Dublin, and from the train station making the way to the Phoenix Park to the Vice Regal Lodge, the home of the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, now Áras an Uachtaráin. And she said she had vaguely remembered her mother talking to men in fancy uniforms. So whether the mother had influence or she reminded them who Charlie was, what his record was, we don't know, but she obviously pressed the right buttons. Charlie was dispatched back to Oldcastle, where, as we know, he was greeted as a hero. I still find it extraordinary that they did let him go, but he obviously had the connections.
Yeah, particularly when, as you say, there was incriminating evidence found on the two escapees. He obviously had connections in all the right places.
He had the connections in the right places, but as I say, if this had happened a year later after the 16 Rising, Charlie Fox would not have walked free.
There's no doubt about it, they were turbulent times. And as John Smith reflects, the reverberations of national and international conflicts were felt very clearly in North Meath.
A huge amount of history takes place, a huge amount is happening. You had the First World War, obviously. You have the potential civil war in the country between the UVF and the Irish Volunteers. And of course the war then suspends that conflict, if you like. Then you had 1916. They brought the Sinn Féin in 1918 elections. You have the setting up of the First Dáil, the 73 MPs abstaining and setting up their own parliament in Dublin. Outbreak of the War of Independence, the treaty negotiations, then the Civil War and the end of the Civil War. I mean, all of this takes place in approximately a 10-year period. And slap bang in the middle of all this, you have the POW camp in Oldcastle. And an awful lot of what was going on is reflected in that history. It is part of a First World War history. I mean, we would not have had the POW camp in Oldcastle if it wasn't for the First World War. You have, the involvement of Sinn Féin, and then by 1918, as the camp is beginning to close, you have, really the anti-conscription protests and marches in Oldcastle, and Arthur Griffith coming, and the whole thing is, and the prisoners then watching this mass protest from the roof of the workhouse. Someone have managed to look at this anti-conscription protest from the roof of the workhouse. We're talking about May 1918 at this stage. What I'm trying to say is that the history of the POW camp, it sort of reflects the wider history that's happening around us. You have to put it in the context of what's going on generally in the country. So the POW camp isn't just an isolated history, it's a history in a wider context.
Well, Jerry, we're back where we started, at the site of the old workhouse cum prisoner of war camp. But as we said before, there's nothing really to see here anymore.
No, Sue, just a few of the perimeter walls. Where we're walking now at the moment is where the actual accommodation blocks stood. Those two blocks, each accommodating 300 people, and it's, as you can see, there's not a trace of it now.
And the houses that are here, and I suppose the people that live here, largely unaware how at one time in history this was really a central point in the World War I and Ireland.
Yeah, some of the older people would be aware of what happened. The younger generation certainly wouldn't, because, as we say, there's not a trace left to see.
And again, we still don't know whatever happened to the two guys. They came back here. I think they were held in solitary confinement. And we don't even know what happened to them after that. Sure, we don't.
No, there's a lot that we don't know. We don't know what happened to most of the prisoners after they left here. We know they were sent to the Isle of Man, where they were treated pretty badly. They were then deported, most of them, back to Germany, regardless whether they had family or wives or people here. They were sent back. So how many of them actually made it back to their families, we don't know.
And apart from the date stamp on the wall over there, there's also, when we look through the gates, there's a headstone.
That's Bully's Acre. That was the graveyard for the workhouse. And it's still known in this area as the German graveyard, because the last person buried in there was Bachmeier, who was shot attempting to escape from the camp. And the cross is reputed to have been erected by his fellow prisoners in memory of not only him, but also all the people who lie in unmarked famine graves in that graveyard.
I'm just struck, I suppose, Jerry, coming back here from all our wanderings. Like, in these times, Cavan is only, as my mother would have said, a hen's race. It's only up the road half an hour by car. But in those days and through those roads, it was a heck of a journey, really.
Well, even if in those days we were using a pony and tramp, it was a day's trip from here to Cavan, but these men were walking, and they weren't also walking the direct route. They were going all through back roads. God knows how many miles or kilometres they walked. It was a fair adventure they went on. It's just a pity it ended as it did.
Escape to Den featured Konstantin and Ferdinand von der Schulenburg as Karl Morlang and Alphonsus Green. The newsreader was Sean Brady, and Schubert's Zum Sanctum was performed by the Navan Male Voice Choir. The researcher was Jerry Boylan, with background research by Sean McCabe. The programme was produced by Sue Russell. Escape to Den was funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.